like to introduce myself a little bit. I'm the son of the founder of Ozark Forest Mushrooms. My mom founded Ozark Forest Mushrooms way back when. So I grew up living between the farm and then also St. Louis. I have a background in plant science, breeding, and genetics. And so I've got a little bit of a science bent, I think you'll find as I give the presentation. And so yeah, I've been involved in mushrooms my entire life, but I also know a lot about gardening and a lot of other things. Another good place, we already got a good introduction about Ozark Forest Mushrooms, but what exactly are we? We're a family farm and distribution business, and we specialize in mushrooms. So the main product that we produce is the heirloom shiitake mushrooms on oak logs, which we source from the areas surrounding our farm. Our farm is in the Ozarks between Salem and Eminence, about 3.5 hours southwest of St. Louis. And our plot is 600 acres, but the whole family farm is actually 3,000 acres. And so we have a rotational timber cut there where we just select the largest logs for timber, and then we take the tops and use them for our shiitake operation. We also do a lot of other things alongside the shiitakes. We also grow oyster mushrooms and lion's mane and black pearl. We also grow basil and various other vegetables and process them into various value-added products. And we also run like a little bit of an agroforestry business and do tours and have an Airbnb on the property. We also distribute mushrooms from other growers and farms, both locally and internationally, and distribute wild edibles. So we'll buy in wild mushrooms, for example, and grade through them and then sell them. Most of our customers, the majority of our business is selling to restaurants and grocery stores. We sell to about 80 different restaurants and grocery stores around Missouri, mostly in the St. Louis region. And we distribute our mushrooms and also live part-time in the Central West End in St. Louis. And so here's just a picture of some of the other products that we can sell. If you guys can see my mouse, you can see there's some wild mushrooms up here, the oysters we cultivate, some of the shishito peppers we grow. We make hot sauce, and so we do lots of different things. So when I was asked to do this presentation, I was trying to think of what would be the most useful way to educate you guys about growing mushrooms at home. There are a lot of really, really good, really informative, very specific practical guides online, and there's a lot of great books. So I decided that I was going to try to err a little bit away from the specifics and really focus on a more of a conceptual framework of how to cultivate mushrooms to get everyone a really good background so they could feel more comfortable going online or going to one of the many mushroom companies and buying up a shiitake log and then being more comfortable at reading the instructions and kind of understanding the larger picture in how to cultivate mushrooms. So with the presentation, I'll start with just describing what are mushrooms to make sure everyone's on the same page and understands. And then I'll get into a more conceptual overview of how to cultivate mushrooms. Most mushrooms follow almost the exact same pattern in how you cultivate them. And then I will give a little anecdote about how we cultivate mushrooms at our farm, specifically the log-grown shiitake mushrooms. And then I'll continue on past that to a more practical guide of how to grow mushrooms at home, focusing more on what kind of supplies you'll need. And then I'll put up a list of some good resources that I recommend, good companies to use to buy mushrooms from or buy spawn from. And then we'll open it up to questions. And the overall goal of this, as I alluded to earlier, is just to make sure you guys have a comfortable framework to go out and find your own information, because there are really so many different types of mushrooms, and there's many different techniques for each mushroom. So it'd be impossible for me to cover it all. So I think this will be a great place to start. So what exactly are mushrooms? Well, mushrooms are the fruiting body of certain types of fungus. And by fruit body, it's the means to which the mushroom uses to reproduce. Most mushrooms look like this picture, with a stem and a cap with gills, and the spores, which are like the seeds of the mushrooms, come out of the gills and are carried by the wind and land somewhere and germinate and grow new fungi. But fungi are really, really diverse. Some don't grow mushrooms. Some are celled, like yeast, and are used to bake bread. Some are more like slime molds. Sometimes you don't consider those fungi, sometimes you do, which are a whole nother organism and have a different lifestyle or life cycle. Um, and some mushrooms don't look like this. Some mushrooms, such as truffles, will actually grow underground and produce spores underground. And to distribute their spores, they'll smell really good to certain types of animals. And the animals will dig up the truffle and ingest it, and then move around and then deposit the spores whenever it decides to use the restroom. So the mushroom is just the fruiting body. The actual body of the fungi is we refer to as mycelium. And mycelium is a mat of what people call hyphae. And hyphae are basically strings of fungal cells that are linked together that have the distinct property that they can fork and bend. And so what a mushroom will do, there'll be a spore that will land, and it will germinate and produce the first hyphae, which will create many more hyphae that grow and fork off of it. And then this will eventually form a large mat. And that large mat we call mycelium, and that's the body of the fungus. And then that mat will grow, and some environmental trigger or its connection with another compatible mycelium will cause it to form a mushroom. And then one last little sciencey thing about mushrooms, one thing that distinguishes them on a um, physiological level is that their cell walls are made out of chitin and glucans and proteins, which is distinctly different from plants, which are made out of more of like cellulose and hemicellulose, and which are different from animals, which have more of a phospholipid bilayer. So those are some biology things that make fungi distinctly different from other organisms. Another important thing to understand that I would just want to make sure everyone understands is how exactly does mycelium grow? Um, Mycelium it will expand outward until the substrate is fully colonized. So what does that mean? Substrate is something I'll be referring to throughout this lecture, and substrate is basically whatever the fungus is growing on, or whatever the mycelium is growing through or feeding off of. So the easiest way to imagine this is imagine putting a spore on a petri dish, and then that spore will germinate. The hyphae will grow outwards in all directions until that the petri dish, which is usually filled with some kind of gelatinous nutrient, usually like agar, for example. And the mycelium will grow outwards until that entire petri dish is colonized. If in the wild, you can imagine this. So imagine that the mycelium, a spore lands on a freshly dead log. That mycelium will germinate, and then it will grow throughout the cellular structure of the log and colonize as much of it as it can until it comes up to some barrier, which will usually be either the outside edge of the log or another fungus that's growing in the log. Another important variable to consider about how mycelium grows is the more surface area that the mycelium has covered or is in contact with, the faster it will grow. So that basically is that the more, because mycelium feeds off of the substrate, the more food it's in contact with, the faster it'll be able to eat it, which makes sense enough. But this is important to consider when you're thinking about the difference between growing mushrooms on logs, for example, or growing mushrooms on sawdust mixed with wheat bran. A log will have considerably less surface area for the mycelium to grow through, just because there'll be less pores for the mycelium to move through and feed off of, because it's an entire solid that only has a couple pores through it, whereas sawdust is ground up, there's lots of surface area. So generally speaking, logs will take a much longer time to colonize than sawdust will. Another thing to consider is the more nutrients and energy the mycelium has, the faster it will grow. That makes sense. It's just like plants. If you give a plant a lot of water and a lot of nitrogen, it will grow really fast. And if it doesn't have a lot of nutrients and it doesn't have water, it's going to grow really slow and it could even die. So mushrooms are very similar to plants in that way. Something to think about with this is if you grow, let's say you have a mushroom that really likes nitrogen, a certain kind of nutrient, and it's growing in sawdust. Sawdust doesn't really have a lot of nitrogen in it. So if you plant, let's say, a shiitake in sawdust and one in sawdust that's mixed with wheat bran, which has a lot of nitrogen in it, the mushroom is going to grow faster in the sawdust mixed with the wheat bran with extra nitrogen, because that, even though they have the same surface area, the one has more nutrients and thus more energy that will allow the mycelium to grow faster. How exactly a mushroom eats the substrate is also important to think about. So a mushroom doesn't really have a mouth. It just has lots of pores on the outer edge of each of the hyphae. And out of these pores, the mushroom will exude, which is a fun word, enzymes and antibiotics and other things that will help digest whatever its food is outside of its body. And then it will absorb the degraded food back through in another pore, which is more like a mouth. So it kind of like chews its food outside of its body and then just absorbs in the rest of it and digests that part of the food. The other way mycelium can feed is they will connect themselves to other living organisms, such as usually plants, and they will connect to the roots, for example, and tap directly into some stream of sugar, and they will absorb the sugar directly from another organism. So those are the two main ways that mushroom producing fungi will feed, and that's important to consider. The other thing to think about is that mushrooms metabolize much like animals and insects. So they will eat food, get sugar and various nutrients they can use as building blocks for their bodies, and they will eat that food and with oxygen be able to produce that energy, and then they will release CO2. So just like we breathe in oxygen and release CO2, mushrooms will do the same. They do not photosynthesize like plants, but they do need sunlight to produce some nutrients, which is something to think about, but they don't need a lot, but they do need a little to make things like vitamin D, for example, just like humans need sunlight to produce vitamin D, which is an important nutrient for our bodies. All right, so what fungi produce mushrooms? There are two main families to think about when thinking about mushrooms, and that's the Ascomyces phylum of fungi and the Basidiomyces phylum. We won't spend too much on this, and you don't really need to know these things, but this can be important if you're considering breeding mushrooms in your house, because these two phylums have differences mainly in their spore structure. But so just all you need to know is there's two main families, and in each of these families, different kinds of fungi in the family will have different lifestyles. Um, and the first one is the mycorrhizal lifestyle, or physiology, which it just means structure and function. And mycorrhizal fungus is a fungus that will form a symbiotic or parasitic relationship with a plant of some sort. And it will usually do this by growing through the soil and connecting with the root of that plant and exchanging water and nutrients such as phosphorus. And in exchange for giving the plant those nutrients, the plant will give the fungus sugars like glucose that the fungus needs to eat. There's two main types of mycorrhizal fungus, and these are ectomycorrhizal and endomycorrhizal. And this, again, you don't really need to know, but that's just the different ways that the fungus attaches itself to the plant roots. So if you're reading some of the more sciencey mushroom literature, you might see these words pop up. And the reason it's important to identify the physiology is that mycorrhizal fungi are not very commonly cultivated, which is why I bring it up. Mycorrhizal fungi, because they're living symbiotically with another organism, it's really hard to mimic that in your backyard or in your farm or even in the laboratory, because there's two organisms, or there's often also bacteria and soil microbes are involved in this relationship as well. And so there's a really complex relationship, and it's occurring underground. So it's really hard to have any control over this relationship. And because of this, you don't often see mushrooms like chanterelles up here in the corner, these orange ones, and morels. They will not be commonly cultivated because of this, because they're mycorrhizal fungi. And just for a fun fact, morels are in the Ascomyces family, and chanterelles are in the Basidiomyces family. So you will not commonly see mycorrhizal fungi cultivated. That being said, it can be done. You can encourage those relationships to happen in a more like wild simulated cultivation. And you can actually, with morels, do a complete cultivation of them, but it's very complicated and it's really easy to screw up. And it's basically only done in China and one test plot in Michigan. So in a very successful economic way. So that's mycorrhizal fungi. Saprotrophic fungi are those fungi that just eat dead carboniferous material or dead plants. So these fungi are very commonly cultivated, and it's a much easier relationship to mimic on your farm or in your backyard because it's just one organism growing on some dead material. So you can categorize saprotrophic fungi into several different groups. And these groups are just basically how it eats that dead material. So white rot saprotrophic fungi are those fungi that will eat the lignin of like usually dead trees. So lignin is a really hard part of woody plants, and that's kind of what makes wood so strong and unbendable. It's a really, really hard carbon compound that's really hard to break down, that basically only mushrooms and termites can digest and turn into energy effectively. And also in the wild, you'll see, like, if you peel apart a fallen over dead tree, and they're called white rot because they usually look white under the bark. Brown rot fungi are those fungi that eat the cellulose and hemicellulose, which are like the softer parts of the wood and part of the cell wall of plants, and they tend to look brown, but this isn't always the case. And then there's also secondary decomposers, which are things like portobello mushrooms, which tend to grow on composted material and have a more complex relationship with other organisms. And like their their food to be broken down a little bit more into simpler, easier to eat carbon compounds. And then there's many other types as well. And many mushrooms don't strictly fall into one of these categories. Some can do multiple things or change around. So it is a little bit complicated, but generally speaking, fungi will fall into one of these categories more than another. So for example, lion's mane over here is a white rot fungus. And so it grows really well on, sawdust and dead trees. And this one here is chicken of the woods, which is a brown rot fungus, which will also grow on dead or dying trees. But they eat different parts of the tree. So theoretically, you could, after the chicken of the woods rots a tree, the lion's mane might eat the rest of the tree, for example, as like an ecological succession kind of deal. All right, so now that we understand what mushrooms are a little bit better, how exactly do you cultivate them? The first step is usually just to asexually or sexually produce new mycelium. So this is either getting a spore on a petri dish, for example, or getting a little chunk of mycelium on a petri dish, and then growing it that way. And so it will germinate and start growing a small mat of mycelium. The second step is typically to expand the mycelium on some kind of easily distributable, I can't even say that right now, substrate. So a kind of substrate that you can easily distribute to other containers easily. So this will typically be something like rye berries or corn or milo or millet, some kind of seed like that that has good nutrients. So all you want to do in the second step is make the mycelium larger so you have more of it to plant in your final substrate, which will be the fruiting substrate. The fruiting substrate can be either a log or it can be a sawdust block mixed with wheat bran or soybean hulls, something like that. And the fruiting block, will change depending on what kind of mushroom you're growing or what style, what kind of thing you want to do with it. And in each of these steps, you have to wait for the substrate to be fully colonized before you move to the next step. So you put the spore on the petri dish, it completely grows out on the petri dish. You cut up the petri dish and you put it into a jar full of rye berries. It grows through the rye berries completely. You break up all those rye berries and you mix them in with more rye berries, and that completely grows out. And then you break up all those rye berries and you mix them in with sawdust and soybean hulls, and you wait for the fruiting block to then be fully colonized. After the fruiting block is fully colonized, you will want to initiate the mushrooms to grow. Is the fourth step. The fifth step is changing the conditions so the fruit body will develop how you want it to. And the sixth step is harvest. And the seventh step is you can rest the fruiting block and usually repeat the initiating pin set step. So this is just the simplest stepwise fashion you can think about of how to cultivate mushrooms. A key thing that you have to follow during all of these steps is something they call sterile technique. And this is very analogous just to pest management, but the term is taken from, laboratory sterile technique, because growing mushrooms is like a mix between laboratory bacterial work and pest management in gardening. And all this really means is that when you are inoculating a substrate, you want to make sure that it is free from other competing fungi or bacteria. So that typically means that you'll want to either pressure cook or steam the straw or sawdust before you inoculate it to kill all the other fungi and bacteria that are in there that could compete with the mushroom that you're trying to grow. It's very analogous to, you want to weed your garden before you plant out your seedlings. And this is the same logic that you use for why you want to have fresh cut logs when you are inoculating a log to grow shiitakes on, for example, because that fresh cut log will be relatively fungi and bacteria free because the tree is getting off all of those things while it was living. And it's also why you want to use a healthy fresh cut log. You don't want to use a log from a tree that's already infected with fungi. You'll also want to make sure that your inoculum or the spawn or the mushroom seeds that you're using are contamination free. So if you've made spawn at home and there's a little blotch of mold on it, you'll likely want to throw out the whole batch or at least remove that mold carefully before you use the rest of that spawn. And this is very similar to having certified disease-free seeds for a garden. You want to make sure that you're working with a clean material to get the most out of all of your efforts. Because if it's diseased from the very start, it will never grow as easily or as well as if it was healthy and strong. You'll also want to consider having a sterile transfer environment. So this will mean that when you're moving the spawn from the petri dish into its first spawn jar of grain, that's step number 2 I mentioned earlier, you want to make sure that during that transfer process, even if both of the substrates you're using are sterile, you'll want to make sure when you open them up to transfer them that bacteria and fungi and spores and dust that are just in the air all around us all the time don't fall in to the substrate and contaminate it and compete with it, because they can often outgrow the mushroom that you're trying to grow and will what they call contaminate your mushroom block. So ways to avoid this are using something like a laminar flow hood, which is basically a fan behind a HEPA filter, which is a filter that takes out all the spores and all the dust in the air up to like 99.9% and blows it in a steady rate in one direction. And so you can work in front of that fan and know that there won't be any mold particles floating around in the air. So you can easily open up your jars and make the transfer and not have to worry about other fungi sneaking in there and competing with the fungi you're trying to grow. A cheaper option that many people will use in home growing operation is something like a still air box. And a still air box can be really fancy, or it can be as simple as a plastic tote put upside down with gloves. You cut out 2 holes in the side and put gloves in there and glue them and make sure it's airtight. You clean out the inside of it with something like isopropyl alcohol or bleach to kill any mold that might be in there. And then you put all your materials in there, close it down, and let all the air rest for about 30 minutes, and all the dust will settle down to the bottom. And that way you minimize the chance greatly of any contamination sneaking into your petri dishes or to your grain spawn or your mushroom fruiting block before it's colonized. You'll also want to make sure you sterilize all the tools you're using. So if you're using like a spoon during this process, you want to make sure you put it under a flame for 10 seconds to kill any bacteria that might be on it. And you'll also want to use gloves and make sure you have clean clothes on and a hat on to make sure that if you are working out in the open, that your like skin cells or the yeast on your hands don't fall into the mushroom substrate and contaminate it as well. Sterile technique also needs to be followed in the mushroom fruiting environment. So when you're growing the mushroom, you also want to make sure everything is really clean, because although once the mushroom block is fully colonized, it can defend itself pretty well and it's much more resistant to contamination. Contamination can still happen, and it will just diminish your yields and lower the quality of the mushrooms you're trying to grow. So a super clean environment isn't 100% necessary. The cleaner it is, the better quality that you'll see when fruiting your mushrooms. And this is just to show you guys some pictures of what it looks like when you don't follow sterile technique close enough. you'll see mold will grow in all of these different horrible ways and ruin all your hard work. So here's just a picture overviewing all the process that I just dictated to you. But unfortunately, I probably won't have enough time to go over it again, but hopefully you guys understand. If not, I believe I can share these slides, or you can look up this photo online. This is from Paul Stamets' book, and it just details the generic mushroom cultivation steps. So for the step number 1, this tissue culture and spore germination, I don't recommend it as much for home growers. This is just to quickly show you how to do it, but this is not a typical practice for most home gardening mushroom growers. But all tissue culture is you basically split a mushroom in half and you cut a little chunk out of the center of it here, and you put it on a petri dish with the right nutrients in the gel that you make on it. And that will cause more mycelium to grow asexually, and it'll basically just make a copy of whatever mushroom you took the sample from. And spore germination is very similar, except to get the spore germination, you basically just get a mature mushroom and you take off the cap of it or whatever the spores come out of on that mushroom, and you'll put it on a piece of foil with a glass over the top of it, and you'll wait a day or so, and all the spores will come out onto the foil, and you'll scrape the spores off the foil and dilute them in sterile water, and then put a drop or two of that on a petri dish, and hopefully some of those spores will germinate and then grow new mycelium. You can do this in different ways too. There's agar culture and liquid culture. So you can germinate spores either on a petri dish on agar, which is just like jello made out of seaweed or potatoes, mixed with some different nutrients in it, depending on what mushroom you're kind of trying to grow. Or you can do the same thing, but in a liquid. And the liquid, you can just do like honey and water and a little malt extract, for example. There's many different recipes. You can look them all up. But some of the benefits of agar is that you can very clearly see how fast it's growing and if there's any contamination. Whereas in liquid culture, it's very hard to see if like there's a green mold growing in there. It just all looks the same. But the downside of agar is that it's a little more difficult to work with, whereas liquid culture can be really convenient to work with, depending on your setup. These are just some pictures showing the G1, the first generation spawn transfer and the second generation spawn transfer. So that's just like, usually there's 2 transfers when you're expanding the mycelium. You do the first one, putting the petri dish into the grain, like this picture in the far right corner. And this is a laminar flow hood. You see this little, what's it called, filter looking thing in the corner. So that's the first generation spawn transfer. And this is just a picture of what it looks like using liquid culture. You usually just use a syringe, and you don't even have to open up the jar. You can have a special lid that you can just inject straight into, which can be nice because it doesn't have to be sterile. And yeah, so those are just some pictures, but these, I don't really recommend doing these steps. I'm probably going to have to speed up a little bit, unfortunately, to make sure I cover everything. But these steps I don't really recommend for home growers because there's a lot more emphasis. Sterile technique is much more important during these steps. The step I recommend most people starting at is either just buying the block or buying spawn from a company that's already made it, and you can make your own substrate by just buying whatever substrate you need for that kind of mushroom, whether it's a log or sawdust, and you just hydrate it, mix it, portion it to the size you need, and then you'll sterilize it and then inoculate it with the spawn that you buy in. So that's what I recommend for most home growers to do if you want to make your own mushroom block, or you can just buy the block from a company that makes them and worry about fruiting them. So to fruit a mushroom block, the first step is the pin set initiation. So after you have a fruiting block that's fully colonized, maybe you bought it or maybe you made it yourself, To initiate pin set, all you need to do is disturb the substrate, lower the temperature, raise the humidity, and increase the oxygen. This kind of imitates what happens in nature, like right before a rainstorm, for example. The mushroom will get all these triggers in nature and decide that it's a good time to fruit the mushrooms. And you can just see some pictures of pin set here. One example is when you're growing on a bag, initiating pin set, you cut a little slice in the bag, which disturbs the substrate, and then you put it in a fruiting room, which has a lower temperature, a higher humidity, and lots of air flowing in it. And that will cause the mushroom to have a really good pin set and have a really large yield. Fruit body development is the next step. And during this step, you don't want to move the substrate around. You want to make sure it stays still. You want to make sure the temperature remains relatively steady. You want to have a slightly lower humidity because really high humidities allow bacteria to compete much easier with the mushroom, and can also cause the mushroom to grow in strange and deformed ways. And then you'll also want to maintain the high oxygen and low CO2 environment, and you'll want lots of light. Here are just some pictures of what happens if you don't have the ideal conditions. If there's not enough oxygen, the mushrooms will get leggy, just like a plant gets leggy when it doesn't have enough sunlight. When it's too dry, the mushroom will crack and often not grow completely correctly, but in some cases it can actually be desirable. And then if it's too humid, oftentimes bacteria will grow, and like this oyster mushroom in this picture on the far right, it will grow orange and not grow properly. So let's see. So how do we cultivate mushrooms at Ozark Forest Mushrooms? We just cut the logs from the forest, right? We'll stack them all up. We'll collect them. We'll drill holes in them with a special drill, usually about 60 holes. We'll fill those holes with sawdust spawn we buy in from Field and Forest Products. We'll cover that hole with wax. We'll then let those mushrooms incubate in a shade house for 6 months. After 6 months, the log will be fully colonized with the shiitake spawn. And you can see here, that's the spawn growing out white of the ends of the logs. And then to initiate pin set, we'll soak the logs in cold water, which raises the humidity, jostles them around to disturb them. It also provides the cold shock I was talking about and lowers the oxygen, and then all of a sudden raises it. All of these things help contribute to a really good mushroom yield. Then we'll put them outside or in the greenhouse, and we'll cover them with a tarp and sprinkle them for a week or so to make sure the humidity remains really high underneath the tarp. And then after about a week or so, we will harvest the mushroom when it's the level of openness that we want. We want the edges to be curled slightly at the edge, still not completely flat, just because that has the highest quality, looks the best, and has the longest shelf life. We also do winter production in a greenhouse, and it's a very, very similar technique, except we have to produce our own shade. We produce extra humidity with a high pressure mister, but we cover the logs just the same, mist them, and then harvest them very similarly, just in a slightly more compacted rack so we can fit more in. And this goes over the life cycle of the log. Just really quickly, we harvest the logs in January because that's when the timber harvests are, and also when the sap is down in the trees. So we get all the logs in then, we inoculate them, we put them in the shade house from January through November. Then all the new logs go into the greenhouse to be fruited from November through March. And then from March to November, we fruit all the logs outside, and they stay out there for the rest of their lives. And the life of the log is typically 3 to 5 years. I'm sorry, I'm moving a little quick just because I feel like I'm running out of time here. But growing mushrooms at home. So now that you've seen how we grow mushrooms at our farm, what's any different about you guys growing mushrooms than how a farm grows mushrooms? Well, the main difference is that you won't have as much equipment, you won't have as much space, you want it to be very affordable, you'll want to minimize any spore or humidity issues. You might not have as much time to do all those really long steps like sterilizing the substrate. If you don't have a pressure cooker, it takes like 14 hours of hot steam to effectively sterilize certain substrates to grow certain mushrooms. Um, and you'll also want it to be fun, tasty, and relatively easy. So you can make spawn at home following the kind of general guides I told you, and you can look up really in-depth details of this on YouTube. But the key things to know is that it's difficult to get right. You'll ideally want to study up a lot of the biology of it all to understand better how to troubleshoot when you inevitably have issues, and to get some of the equipment that you do need. It can be a little bit expensive. Like a laminar flow hood is anywhere, the smallest, littlest ones are anywhere from like $300 to $500. But you can make a still air box and stuff, but it's quite difficult to do this without some of the proper equipment. So if you do want to do that, feel free. There's lots of resources. So you can research that. I'll spend more time talking about how to make a fruiting substrate at home. The easiest way is just to buy in the spawn from a company, and I'll have a list of companies at the end here. And you will follow the instructions they give you. All you need to have is just a clean area or a still air box, ideally, to make the transfer happen of the spawn into whatever fruiting substrate you're using. You'll want a reusable plastic container or mushroom bags if you are not using a log. You'll want a pressure cooker, a storage area, and then the substrate, either a log or you can use sawdust mixed with wheat bran and soybean hulls for many mushroom types. And you can also use straw for other mushrooms like oysters. To fruit mushrooms at home, you will need a fully colonized mushroom substrate, either made by yourself or you can buy them in from companies such as North Spore in these little boxes here. And you'll want to have a grow area, some type of humidification system, some type of temperature control, and then some source of light. But you don't need a lot of light, but they do need a little bit of light, like 5% light, 95% shade. So a grow area, you can either make a monotub, which is just a plastic tote with a lid on it with some type of humidification system attached to it, or you just mist it 3 times a day with a hand mister. You can make a mini greenhouse, such as this picture here, which is just a shelf inside a plastic covering with a zip on it with a humidifier attached, and then you just need to vent this out once or twice a day to make sure there's enough oxygen inside. For log production, all you need is a shady yard, so a yard that has some humidity to it, 95% shade, and then you will need some kind of like humidity blanket. Usually like the agricultural frost blankets are what we use and find easy and affordable. And you can produce mushrooms that way. And the other thing to consider is temperature. All mushrooms will have a specific temperature range which they like to grow in. We get around this. We grow a cold season variety of shiitake, a warm weather strain, a hot weather strain, and then we also have a greenhouse, so we can produce the mushrooms all year round. But it's important to note, depending on what you're trying to accomplish, some mushrooms have different strains or varieties that are better in certain temperatures. So it's important to consider this when you're trying to fruit mushrooms at home, or you can just realize that you'll only get mushrooms in a very specific season. Let's say if you're growing shiitakes outside, you'll probably only get them during the spring and the fall after it's been raining a lot, for example. All right, so I'm sorry I had to speed up there at the end, but it was a little bit too long-winded in the beginning. But all of this information can be easily found online. The my the mushroom community on the internet is actually quite robust. There's tons of resources out there. There's almost too much out there, and it can be a little bit dizzying and kind of hard to find your way. So hopefully, from this talk, you've been able to get some of the kind of the key fundamentals to help guide you on your mushroom journey. Some recommended online resources and places to buy spawn are listed here. Field and Forest are our friends. They started way back when with us. I used to hang out with them all the time, and we use them to buy all of our shiitake spawn. They specialize in various log production techniques, so you can get oyster mushrooms, shiitake mushrooms, and chicken of the woods. And they have guides online and a YouTube channel, so you can buy it all. They sell the tools and have all the instructions. And then you can just use some of the knowledge, the basic knowledge you've got here, and then more online resources and books to help troubleshoot any issues you might have during that adventure. There's also like companies like Fresh Cap and North Spore, Southwest Mushrooms, Earth Angel Mushrooms, Myers Mushrooms. All these companies have YouTube channels with tons of really helpful information and guides on how to grow certain types of mushrooms. They often provide the tools as well. And there's also tons of like Reddit threads and all sorts of stuff with actually a lot of good information. But not everything you find is actually the easiest or the best way to do it. But sometimes if that's just the equipment you have lying around, then it might be a fun way to try out how to grow mushrooms, and it'll probably, it probably will work with some success. Um, so Oh, and then also here's some book resources here. These are kind of these three books are the three main mushroom cultivation books I recommend. There are a lot of them, but these three, just all you need is one of them, and it'll probably cover everything you need to know. Growing Gourmet and Medicinal Mushrooms is kind of the standard by Paul Stamets. It has everything you need to know for most of the popular kinds of mushrooms, though it is a bit dated. It doesn't have the best pictures, and he's not always the most clear. Um, and he can be a little bit sciencey and academic at times. The Organic Mushrooms Farming and Micromediation book by Chelsea Green is really good. It's got great pictures. It's much more holistic and talks more about like experimental, less than ideal ways that are easy, like making cardboard spawn. You can grow mushrooms on cardboard and use that to inoculate stuff. That's much easier for most home growers to get their hands on. So that's a really good one. And then there's also the older book, The Mushroom Cultivator, which has really good information on like how to build a larger grow room and stuff like that. And then my one mushroom, if you're just getting into mushrooms, or you probably need a little bit more of a science background for this book, but just a little bit of mushroom knowledge. But Entangled Life is the only you know mushroom nonfiction book. It's not about cultivating mushrooms, it's just about mushrooms in general. I really enjoyed this book. It's really good. The other popular one is Mycelium Running by Paul Stamets. That one's really good as well, but I like this one better. So if I was to recommend one, I'd recommend reading Entangled Life if you'd like to get more into mushrooms. So the next steps from here I'd recommend is decide on what your mushroom goal is. If it's just to buy in a shiitake block from a company and grow some fresh shiitakes so you can have the peak freshness of the mushrooms, then choose that. Research some of the best places, like going to this talk. You've heard I've said Field and Forest Mushrooms has really great shiitake blocks and easy instructions. You'll buy it in and you'll be able to follow their instructions and fruit the block effectively doing that. And there's always trial and error in all of this, but you just, because mushrooms are finicky and they're different, and we're not as familiar with them as a society as we are as with plants. So there definitely is some trial and error, even if you've educated yourself well, but you just want to make sure you understand the parameters well enough to make educated adjustments as you figure out how to grow mushrooms. All right, so that's the end of my talk. And I think we can open it up to questions now. I'm sorry if I've gone over my time a little bit. Um,
No,
I
no, I think you're good. That was great. Yeah, we got a couple questions here. Let me see. So first one, we had a couple questions about when you were talking about like the different substrate options. So like a couple specifically about like logs versus sawdust. So like, are there trade-offs between the two? Like, why would you want to grow on logs instead of sawdust if it's slower? Are there like differences in like nutrient concentration of growing mushrooms on different substrates, stuff like that?
yeah, so the let's see. So there's advantages and disadvantages of both growing on logs and growing on sawdust. They're just very different. The advantages of growing on logs is you don't need to worry about the sterile method as much. Um, you do need to make sure you have a good environment for the mushroom to grow, but you don't have to have a still air box or a HEPA filter to successfully grow the mushrooms. That being said, basically only shiitakes, I would say, are really effectively grown on logs. All other mushroom, you can grow oysters and lion's mane and chicken of the woods on logs, but you will not be able to get a high yield, and you can't really predict or trigger them to fruit on any predictable basis. So they can be good for a backyard and they can be fun, but you won't get as big a reward growing on logs unless you're growing shiitakes, basically. And they do take a really long time to colonize. But the reason we grow on logs is we are in timber country. There's tons of cordwood cutters. We can get logs cheaper than anyone else. They don't use plastic like in most of these sawdust blocks. You need to use lots of plastic. You need to have a way to sterilize the substrate, which uses lots of energy. And then also you can't grow on blocks outside effectively because they'll get contaminated and eaten by bugs really easily, whereas logs can be grown outside, which allows you to not have to build a building, and then also allows the mushrooms to get UV light and produce more vitamin D and other nutrients that are produced by sunlight. So our log-grown shiitakes, for example, there's a study at University of Missouri researching this right now, but it's already been proven at other places. Log-grown outside shiitakes will have a much greater amounts of vitamin D and some other things than sawdust-grown shiitakes. But
Cool.
but sawdust grown mushrooms, you'll get a way higher yield. They'll grow much quicker. You know, you can inoculate an oyster sawdust bag, and it will in 2 weeks it will start pinning and growing mushrooms after you inoculate it, and it will produce 2 to 3 pounds in that first flush if you've done everything correctly. And then you can just throw it away, or you can grow another half a pound off of it or something on average. Um, and so it's a much quicker turnaround, and you get a lot more for your efforts over per unit of time, I guess. But it's not as holistic, and there's plastic and lots of energy involved to sterilize the substrate.
Got it. And then another question about the like sawdust. And I imagine this question would be with logs too. Does the species of the wood matter?
Yes, it does. We only use white oak and red oak cordwood for shiitakes. Shiitakes can grow on many different types of trees, but you'll want to select a strain that works best for that type of wood. With sawdust, on the other hand, uh, usually white oak sawdust is the best uh, for all mushrooms, only because the cellular structure of white oak like the reason that they use white oak for whiskey barrels, for example, because it has a really rigid cell structure that doesn't let liquid permeate through as much, which is the same reason that it doesn't get infected as easily by fungal pathogens. So it means it's like fungus-free sawdust. It's much more sterile, and you don't have to. It's harder for other things to grow in it when you inoculate it, which makes it an ideal. You can also, but you can grow on pretty much any sawdust, any hardwood sawdust that's not pine. For almost all of these saprophytic mushrooms that are popular, they can grow on any non-pine hardwood. And there's some that grow on pine, but I'd say like 95% of the mushrooms will grow on any hardwood sawdust after it's been pressure cooked, because the pressure cooking will break down any of the compounds that are like allelopathic or will inhibit growth of the fungus, because the heat breaks that down when you sterilize it, which is one of the reasons why heat sterilization is the most common. Even though there are other methods to sterilize, they still use heat sterilization because it destroys some of those compounds that inhibit fungal growth.
Interesting. And then we had a question about the water. Does it matter? Like, because most home gardeners have tap water. Like, is the chlorine an issue? Do you need to? Are you using tap water?
The chlorine can be an issue. At a farm, we're using well water, and all it's treated. It's just treated with UV light for the farm operation. But they don't want too much chlorine. But we also we're expanding our city operation right now, and we're trying to get into more blocks. Like, we're trying to double down of shiitakes at the farm, and then grow oysters and lion's mane at a grow house, like building in the city. And I've been experimenting with that and using our St. Louis City tap water, and it has no effect. It's fine. But ideally, the chloride is one of those chemicals that inhibits fungal growth. So in high concentrations, it will inhibit fungal growth considerably.
Got it. Somebody asked if it's possible to inoculate, I assume like the same substrate with multiple species of mushroom.
You can do that, but they won't all grow into and with each other. They'll kind of form a barrier, like they'll grow out into the point that they connect, and then they'll kind of wall off from one another. I've done it on accident one time. Like, I inoculated something and then I inoculated again without realizing. And but they just grow up to each other, and you can kind of see a line between them. But sometimes one will kill the other because it has some chemical that it can produce that kills the other one. So it just depends on the combination. But you can get them to fruit out of the same substrate, but I wouldn't recommend it. It would be not efficient. But it's definitely possible. But it's not ideal, because then they spend energy fighting one another instead of just growing mushrooms.
Got it. Somebody else asked, do you have any recommendations to keep insects from getting into mushrooms when they are outside fruiting? They said they grew oyster mushrooms and they had issues where they were covered with very small worms and insects during the spring and summer.
Yeah, so the other reason not to grow other mushrooms on logs outside is because flies and bugs love them. Slugs can't get enough of them. Shiitakes produce formaldehyde, which actually wards bugs away generally, like low levels of formaldehyde and other chemicals that keeps many bugs away that actually eat them. But the best thing to do is cover it with that frost blanket or humidity blanket, as just like you do with plants during the winter. That provides a physical barrier which inhibits a lot of bugs that are flying around from sensing that there's a mushroom close by that might be tasty to hang out in. The other thing you can do is we use sticky traps, not outside with shiitakes, but we use sticky traps in our indoor grow houses. And then we don't spray anything while they're growing, but when when you clean out the house, like you get rid of all the bags in that growing area, we will spray like pyrethrum and neem to make sure there's no bug eggs. But generally you want to start with a clean area, and then you want to wall it off so no bugs can get in. And then you want to grow inside of that. And then you want to get rid of everything that's in there and clean it out again, because bugs, uh, fruit flies and fungus gnats are the number one pest, because they carry bacteria on their feet and in their mouths, and then that bacteria will grow on the mushrooms and create orange slimy blobs, and cause the yield to be lower and stuff.
Got it.
But yeah, it's generally exclusion is like keeping them out in the first place is basically the only effective strategy.
Got it. Are there concerns with like health concerns with the spores or dealing with the in terms of inhalation of the spores?
Yes, there's mushroom lung, but it's most people aren't actually sensitive to it, and you catch most of it in your mucous membranes, and then you just blow it out with your snot. It's really not very dangerous, but some people are sensitive to it and will get flu-like symptoms if they hang out in a mushroom house right before harvest when all the mushrooms are sporing for like 10 to 20 minutes, and they'll start to get a headache, a mild headache. And then if you stay in there after 20 minutes, this is like the average that I've read in research papers, is like a 20-minute onset. And the longer you stay in it, the worse flu-like symptoms you'll have for like the next hour. But it's not very serious. I have not seen many like mushroom worker health cases of mushroom lung problems. My whole family, we have no lung problems. We got plenty of other health problems, but no no lung problems. I have zero issues with it personally. I hang out in there all day. I usually don't wear the mask, but it is recommended that you wear a mask, just like with COVID, to keep the spores out of your lungs, because they are fine particles that can clog up your alveoli and cause issues. But they're not going to germinate. The cultivated mushrooms we grow aren't going to like germinate inside your lungs and cause issues. That being said, other fungi in the dust in like Utah, for example, will, and it will kill you. So it can be an issue, but not with the cultivated varieties that are common.
And that's really an issue for like indoor growing, I would assume. Like if you have logs outside, it probably wouldn't be.
Yeah, it's a non-issue. And even in our greenhouse, it has that's one reason you want kind of like a large space with a lot of air movement, so there isn't as high density of spores in the air. But it's really not a serious issue. But and in most of the really large mushroom houses, like button mushrooms are really popular because they don't actually let the spores ever come out, so they don't have to deal with it, for example. And that's one reason, among many other things, why those are popular. But some shiitake varieties they're breeding in Japan and that are getting more popular, which you'll probably see, they don't ever open up. They've been like genetically bred to not actually even open up and release spores. And so varieties like that are becoming more popular because of the spore issue, but also it's mostly just aesthetic. They look really nice when you cut them. They have like this really nice curl to them. So
Um, so we had one person ask if you have thoughts on breaking up spent substrate. Will the mycelium in there spread after fruiting or not?
Yeah, it will spread through a compost pile and grow. It'll usually though, if you mix it in with wood chips, it'll probably grow some. Um, but it's no guarantee, and there's already other contamination in there. So it's just, you can't guarantee that it'll do anything, but it very well could do anything. We it becomes just like not efficient with your time usage for the reward you'll typically get from it. It'd be probably more efficient to buy spawn and then inoculate what you want to inoculate, because over time the mycelium will get tired. Like just like old people, their genomes, their chromosomes start to split apart and more errors happen. And that happens with mushrooms as they replicate over time. So you usually want new genetic recombination, so the bonds in the chromosomes are tighter. So if you keep growing the same mycelium out over time asexually, it will start to have issues because of genetics, and also because viruses and other things will be in its system and causing issues and lowering the yield and vigor of it over time.
Got it. We also had a couple people ask if you could give them like an idea of what the best or easiest outdoor mushroom option would be for a novice gardener, for a kid's garden, stuff like that.
Yeah, so there's probably three options I would recommend. The first is shiitake, like I showed you guys. I know I had to move quickly at the end. I kind of talked a little too long at the beginning, but the growing shiitakes on hardwood logs is pretty easy. You can just buy sawdust spawn from one of those companies and drill some holes, cover those holes with wax, and then leave it in a shady area, and make sure it doesn't dry out. Water it once or every other week or something if it looks dry, and then you'll be able to fruit that log for up to 3 years if it gets successfully colonized. The length of its life usually depends on how big the log is. And so that's option number one, is growing shiitakes on logs, not on sawdust. On sawdust, they're a little trickier than other mushrooms. The other option is the wine cap or King Stropharia. And these are a mushroom you can get from both North Spore and Field and Forest through the mail. And those, you basically just make a nice pile of wood chips outside, like wood chips over freshly tilled earth and straw, and you mix the spawn in with the wood chips, cover it up, make sure it stays humid and shaded for a couple months, and then the King Stropharia will grow out of there every time it rains, as long as it gets colonized for the next couple of years. And they're kind of like a portabella. They're different. They have a horrible shelf life, but they are really easy to grow. So that's why you don't see them in stores, but they're very, very popular to grow because they're very aggressive and easy to plant, and you can grow them outside and they taste really good. They're kind of like a portabella that has this kind of wine flavor to it, which is intriguing. And the other one is oyster mushrooms. Oyster mushrooms are by far the easiest ones to grow on sawdust blocks or on straw. I would not recommend growing them on logs, but it can be done, but you'll have bug issues and things like that. And it'll just fruit randomly. You won't be able to kind of control when you get mushrooms. And growing oysters on straw is what I would recommend. You can just boil straw for an hour or two, stick it in a chop it up, boil it, stick it in a bag with some oyster spawn you buy in, and it'll colonize that straw in 2 to 3 weeks if you do everything correctly. And you can poke holes in that, and then they'll grow out the side of the holes as long as you keep it humid. And you can do that outside in a shady area. It's better to do it inside so you don't have to mess around with all the bugs that are going to come to it inevitably. You usually won't get bugs if you grow inside. If you just let it grow 1 or 2 flushes, the bugs won't find it in those couple weeks before you're done with it. And growing on straw, you can fruit that block maybe 2 to 3 times is what I would recommend. After that, it'll get covered in mold and bacteria. It'll still grow mushrooms, but you don't want to deal with all that mold in your house or on your mushrooms. Or you might want to, but I wouldn't recommend it as much, even though they're perfectly edible still. So yes, shiitake on logs, King Stropharia on wood chip beds, and oyster mushrooms on straw or cardboard or sawdust and soybean hulls.
We do still have a couple more questions. Are you good?
Oh yeah, I'm good.
Okay, cool. Do you have at Ozark Forest, do you have educational tours or possibilities for school visits?
So we're 3.5 hours south. So at the farm, there isn't any possibility. In St. Louis, we currently do not have the possibility at our distribution hub. And we also have like a greenhouse there that we're temporarily growing in, but we are shopping around and have the financing to buy a new location at this moment. I just saw a couple places the other day. It's taking a while to find the right place, but as soon as we move into the new location, which we will be growing mushrooms in, we would like to open it up to tours, but that's, a year or two in the future. We'll keep you posted, but if we do allow tours, that will be on our website, ozarkforest.com. Right now, the only tourism that we do is our Airbnb at the farm, which, and we have an Airbnb in St. Louis too, but it's not really connected with the mushrooms. But you can find links to that on our website. And with that Airbnb stay, you get a tour of the mushroom farm for free. But that's, 3 hours south. It's in the middle of nowhere. There's no other people close by except for us. And we're working with Venku right now, but this is still in the works and might not pan out. Venku is like an outdoor tour company in Missouri, and we are working to get like maybe a 2 or 3 times a year mushroom tour going again, because they cover liability, which is the main reason we don't do tours anymore. Because liability insurance is a real thing and very expensive. But Venku and Airbnb events will cover stuff like that. So we're considering doing that, but we've got a lot of irons in the fire right now with looking for a new spot and expanding the grow operation right now. But theoretically, yes, in the future, soon enough.
Got it. Someone else asked, and I'm not sure if they mean logs that are already inoculated or trees, but they say with the recent ice storm, would oak logs that were damaged still be effective and worth considering?
Yeah, if they've been dead for like under a year, you can probably grow shiitakes on them. Yeah, but it just depends. Like, you don't want a log that's been like fractured and split apart. You want it to be whole still. But yeah, the branch wood on something like that, if it was just felled not that long ago this winter, it would be fine to use for shiitakes, depending on what species it is. You generally want it to be an oak, but stuff like certain types of like black walnut and sycamore and stuff like that won't work at all. So
Got it.
but you can look up a list of the woods that you can use for shiitake production online. And if you call Field and Forest, if you tell them what kind of wood you have, they'll send you the variety of shiitake that works the best for it. So
That's nice. So someone else asked, if you have 2 flushes growing in a bucket, can you add more sawdust to the bucket to get more mushrooms, or do you have to start over every time?
You can add more sawdust to the bucket and it will keep growing, but it will have a high risk of contaminating in that new growth area. Even if you pasteurize that sawdust beforehand and put it in, because it's already been open to the environment, there are other spores of like green mold, like trichoderma, waiting there, which will grow far, far quicker and outcompete it. So it can theoretically be done. I've done it before. It's not as because like more than half of them will fail. It's more efficient just to make a new tub.
Got it.
Every time. So I do like 3 flushes out of the bigger the substrate, the more flushes you can get off of it, generally speaking. So if it's like a 5-gallon bucket, for example, you could probably get 3 or 4 flushes out of that. But generally speaking, a 10-pound block, from the data I've seen of most research, is like the most efficient per, like, financially and for the amount of mushrooms you get. And you can get 2 to 3 flushes out of a 10-pound block. And it's something about like the surface area ratio and like the amount of effort and time it takes. So that's why most small to mid-scale farms use like those 10-pound plastic bags, the autoclave mushroom bags. That's probably the cheapest and most efficient. It doesn't mean it's like the most sustainable or the best way to do it, but that's probably one of the easier economic and efficient ways to do it.
Got it. And it sounded like you said you're doing you have an indoor facility in St. Louis, correct? In the Central West End?
Yes, but it's just like a shanty greenhouse. I've only been back for about a year in St. Louis, a little over a year. I just started moved back here after working in California and other places. And so I've just been expanding us into more block production, just because we already buy them in from other farmers that grow them. But some of those farmers actually recently went out of business. So we're just going to grow all the stuff they used to grow and that we already sell. So yeah, we're growing, but it's just like a double layered greenhouse I built in the backyard out of salvaged materials I got out of the building I was helping demo right before I got here. So it's like a 50-foot by 14-foot greenhouse, and I produce something like 350 pounds of mushrooms out of that every week now. But it's like stuffed to the gills with like 210 pounds bags every week. So so that's 2,000 pounds of like mushroom substrate every week in the, which is why we're buying a building to be able to expand that further.
Got it. So somebody asked about if it would make sense for indoor growers, and obviously they don't need much light, but to do full spectrum lighting to get some of the potential like vitamin D benefits of sunlight.
You can, I think you can get away with like blue spectrum. It depends on the mushroom variety though. So but I think most mushroom growers just use blue spectrum lighting for most of it, and that is the frequency of the photons that allows for the vitamin D to be formed, or for most of the color. But I personally, I grow in right now in a greenhouse, so I have real sunlight coming in with just shade, and then during the summer I have to blast AC in there. But you need so much ventilation that it doesn't really matter, because you have to blast AC and then vent the air because you need more oxygen. So but it's not ideal in a greenhouse. But I would say the quality from real sunlight is noticeable at an eye level and a flavor level. But it's super subtle though. It's like only if you grow mushrooms all the time are you really going to notice that real sunlight does have a distinctive quality difference. But it depends on variety too. I mean, every variety of mushroom is different. Lion's mane don't look any different with or without light, for example, but they're completely white. Whereas yellow oysters, for example, with like just blue light, they'll grow really like kind of a nice creamy yellow color, but with really high UV rates, they'll turn almost orange, like this orange, really vibrant yellow. So, and obviously those different pigments are different, like phenolic and compounds that have some nutrient quality to them.
Got
Yeah.
it. So I was like, just a couple more. I say people are still hanging on and asking questions.
Yeah, no, I've got nothing else going on right now in
All
the
right,
COVID
cool.
lifestyle. So,
All right. So somebody asked, I know early in the presentation you mentioned that people growing, in terms of growing mycorrhizal fungi, that it's really just done in China, and then you said like one lab or research plot in Michigan, I think you
yeah,
said, and you
that's
were asking if you know the name of that place.
I don't know if I meant to say it. I heard it through a grapevine, but
Okay.
so we were on like the grant review for it, but you might be able to find it. I don't think it's that secretive. You can look up the methods. There's research papers on public journal sites that you can look up on the method that they use in China to cultivate morels successfully. And it basically involves you do one kind of strain. You grow it all in bags, just like sawdust bags, like you do any mushroom. But you have one that you mix into the soil with a special nutrient mix, and then you have another type that you grow in a bag separately with special nutrition and special environmental conditions that you then, after the bed in the ground is made, you add this other bag on top of the bed and with a slit in it. And when those two mycelium grow together, the mushrooms that are inoculated in the like sawdust and soil bed that you made, when it comes into contact with that other bag, that initiates the fruiting of this specific type of morel. And they're more of a burn morel variety. So they're a black morel. The golden morels here don't respond to fire as well, but the black morels on like Oregon, they fruit usually after a forest fire. They fruit really heavily. So they turn from they turn into more of a parasite off of their dead old hosts, and they fruit like crazy. And so those have that kind of blurred line of mycorrhizal and then also what's it called, like a white rot kind of fungus. So they switch from mycorrhizal to like full on parasite and fruit like heavy. So because they have that in their genetics, you can manipulate them as such to produce more like the other mushrooms that aren't mycorrhizal.
Got it. Huh.
Because they also have that suite of enzymes to
Yeah.
not just feed off the sugars from the tree, but to also break down the tree after it dies. So that's kind of the long and short of it, but they're doing it in China on like a major scale, like tens of thousands of hectares. And you can buy them dried, and it's confusing, and a lot of them are labeled as Oregon black chanterelles, but actually come from farms in China. So it's the mushroom business is very corrupt and secretive and shady in some parts, like the truffles and morels. It's very secretive, and also the reason I can't mention it is because we're on like a review for their grant. They sent out like the grant reviewers allowed us to review the application or something.
So someone else asked, what do you do with your spent growing substrates?
We bring it all down to the farm and we compost it and we put it on our garden that we grow, thousands of pounds of basil, and we grow mostly basil, serrano peppers, and what's the other thing? Banana peppers and shishito peppers are like the four main crops we grow commercially. And so we just use it as a supplement, but you have to compost it again. So it's like the white rot fungus breaks down all the lignin, which usually doesn't compost very well. So it makes really easy and quick compost. The only issue is it's often in this hard block that doesn't break apart easily. And so you have to take it out of the bags, and then you have to either crush it and then it'll compost really quickly, or you just leave it in a big pile and make sure it gets wet and they'll break down over a longer period of time. But you can make compost in like 2 weeks with it. That's really effective if you break down the blocks and water it heavily in a warm time of the year. You usually want to supplement it with a little bit of material that has more nitrogen to get the right carbon nitrogen ratio, because the mushrooms that you've harvested have taken most of the nitrogen out of the block, so it has slightly high carbon to nitrogen ratio for compost, for ideal compost temperatures. But you don't need to know any of that. You can just put it in a pile and it'll break down and turn into solid compost.
Got it. And then kind of like a two-part kind of follow-up to that would be, I'm imagining there's not really much you can do with the plastic bags, like in terms of recycling those, or because they're probably pretty dirty and
Nope.
stuff at that
Yeah.
point.
No, you can't recycle. It's polypropylene, and it's cooked, and then it's usually has UV damage to it, so it's really friable, horrible, turns into microplastics like nothing. But we I've been doing experiments. They do have compostable plastic, like organic polypropylene compostable bags. They're not as easy to work with. They like, break down as the mushrooms grow, like the bag will start to disintegrate sometimes.
Mm.
Also, some of those still create microplastics that are just as harmful. If you really get into the chemistry and reality of it, you have to do a lot of research if you're really trying to avoid the damage you're trying to mitigate with those plastic bags. The real solution is growing in plastic bottles, like these really large companies in China and Japan and California and Pennsylvania do, which are like reusable quart-sized bottles that are specially designed for mushroom growing. But to use those, you need a lot of specialized equipment. They're designed for a completely mechanized system, but the issue with them is it's really hard to get the sawdust out of them. So you have to have a special drill contraption that goes down and like breaks all the sawdust out of the bottles. Because if you were to have to get all of those out by hand, it would take you hours and would take so much labor. It would easily cost you like triple to do that. But when it's mechanized, it's way more efficient. So that's the real ideal, is to get mechanized bottle culture to minimize the waste issue, or to grow on logs like we do at the farm,
Mhm.
or to find a compostable bag that is
Actually
using the
done.
right chemistry that doesn't still produce harmful byproducts.
Yeah. And a lot of times too, I know that those plastics that claim to be compostable are only compostable in industrial composting facilities. Like they're not compostable in like a backyard composting setting.
Yeah, and most of them are designed for like landfills in mind. So like you stick it in
Yeah.
a landfill and it'll break down in that anaerobic horrible pile of who knows what. Um, but they'll still blow around and create microplastics in the meantime if they don't go in they'll blow out of the landfill before they get buried and stuff still. So they still have lots of issues with them. Um, but we would like to experiment with putting them in a grinder and composting them at the farm with the bags, because taking the substrate out of the bag is incredibly labor intensive and gross,
Mhm.
because you usually don't get around to it right away, so you let them rot a little bit in there and then you got to hack them all out of there and they're all slimy and stinky. So we would like to find a way just to be able to pile them in the bags and compost them just like that without the plastic blowing away. But um, and the other option is to grow in like 5-gallon buckets, but that doesn't work easily for a variety of reasons on an economic scale, and is less than ideal because of a surface area issue. They're too big, so the insides get too hot. Uh, you get a lower yield and more contamination issues because of the size of it. And if you go smaller, then you have the same problem you have with the mushroom bottles, that it's hard to get the substrate out and takes forever. So those are more just like economic business reasons why you can't use them. But on a hobby scale, you can definitely use those reusable containers.
Okay. So I think our last question here is from a garden that we work with that actually has a cave underneath them. And they had asked about if you know anything about pros or cons of growing mushrooms in a cave, if that's a good spot for it or.
Yeah, I mean, caves are great, except for you have to have ventilation. So it depends how many mushrooms you put in there. But if you fill up a cave with mushrooms, it's going to quickly diminish all the oxygen in there if there's not a good flow through. So it depends on the kind of cave. Many caves actually have another side to them, and so there's a draft that moves through, and that functions well for growing mushrooms. But the main downside is that there's like dirt on the ground. It's hard to get water to if it ever gets a little bit dry in there. There's usually not water access in most caves.
Yeah.
And if you do use water, you'll make the ground all muddy and gross.
Mm.
Um, and the other thing is I don't know what kind of cave it is. If it's an old like mine shaft, you're not really going to be disturbing wildlife. But we were growing, we have caves at our farm. We have tons of caves, like really amazing caves that go back for miles and stuff. Um, but there's like endangered salamanders and blind crayfish in there. Like I don't need to trample all over them to grow mushrooms when it's easier and more scalable in a basement or in a greenhouse and stuff like that. But yes, if you just have a few shiitake logs, you can definitely grow them effectively and in harmony with nature. But you probably don't want to scale it too much in a cave.
Got it. All right. Well, yeah, I think that is our last question. Thanks so much for the presentation and then for hanging on so long to answer everybody's questions. Yeah, and thanks everybody who's still hanging on here for attending. If you have any comments or questions that come up later, feel free to reach out to Gateway Greening. You can just find all of our emails on our website, and we'll do our best to answer those questions for you. But yeah, thanks again. Have a good night.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. Have a good one.